Hi, this is Tucker with our SAT vocabulary list number 31. Please take Cornell notes, write down the word, the part of speech, the definition, and any examples that I say that will help you to remember these words. And remember, if at any point I'm going too fast, feel free to pause the recording. The first word is alleviate. This is a verb, and to alleviate means to make something easier to endure, to make it less burdensome, or less hard to bear. So typically, if you're alleviating something with kind of negative connotation. So maybe you're alleviating pain, or you're alleviating sorrow, or you're alleviating boredom. Now, if we think of how do people typically alleviate pain, they tend to turn to pain medication, or if you have dry eyes, you're trying to alleviate your dry eyes because of allergies, you might use eye drops, etc. 2 is avert. Avert is also a verb, and it means to turn away or turn aside. So if, you're shopping with a friend and your friend wants your input on the clothes she's trying on, and you go into the dressing room together, you might avert your eyes. So you're not like staring at your friend while she's trying on her clothes, but you're still there so you can give her your opinion. So if you avert your eyes or you kind of avert your glance, you're looking away, sometimes because you don't want to see what somebody else is doing, sometimes just to give them privacy. In this picture, clearly this guy is like, I don't want to see what you're doing. He's averting his eyes, kind of putting his hand up so he doesn't have to see whatever is taking place near or around him. Number 3 is deduce. Deduce is also a verb, and it means to draw a conclusion. So to derive or draw a conclusion based on some reasoning, usually you'll have some information, you use that information, you'll think about it, you'll reason, and then you'll draw a conclusion. So when you deduce, you're kind of working out, it's almost like a puzzle. You're trying to figure something out based on the information you have. And when you deduce, you're drawing a conclusion based on that information. One of the little books that my kids love are the whole Scooby-Doo series, because what are they doing the entire time in the Scooby-Doo books and in the show, obviously. They don't watch the show, but they're constantly working out some big mystery, right? Somebody's done something and they're trying to figure out who it is. They're trying to deduce who might have committed a particular crime based on the information they have. And anybody who's familiar with this series or the little kids books that have come after it know that Scooby-Doo they're always surprised because you pull the mask off and it's someone that they, hadn't even realized might be the perpetrator behind the crime. Number 4 is erroneous. And erroneous describes something that is incorrect or wrong. It's something that contains a mistake or some kind of error. And so a lot of times when, you hear the word erroneous, you might hear about an erroneous error that was made, some big mistake that was made, maybe at the government level. If you think about people who have sworn, I was outside, I was on a camping trip, I saw this light in the sky, it must be a UFO. A lot of times those accounts end up being erroneous, right? There's some other kind of anomaly that's happened that has, created this light in the sky, and it's not actually a UFO. 5 is impetuous, and someone who is described as impetuous, because this is an adjective, it's a describing word, someone who is impetuous is impulsive. And try to remember, impetuous, impulsive. They both start with the IMP. It might help you remember. And someone who's impetuous or impulsive makes kind of sudden, maybe rash decisions, or they act in kind of a spontaneous way without really thinking through whether they should be doing what they're doing. So impetuous, someone who's impetuous can be fun and spontaneous, so it can be a positive word. But someone who's impetuous can also be kind of foolish and maybe not think through consequences. And so in that way, it might not be a positive word. So it's one of those words that can have positive connotations and negative connotations depending on how it's used. So here we have three ladies. They have clearly spent the day shopping, and as any shopper can attest, we all have our moments where we go to a store, we see things we love, and we just start grabbing them off the hangers and trying them on. And maybe these purchases, because that is a lot of bags and a nice label, it might be described as impetuous purchases, where later you get the credit card bill and you wonder, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? Intrepid describes, again, a describing word, an adjective. Intrepid describes someone who is fearless, bold, not afraid to act. And so someone who's impetuous might also be considered kind of intrepid because they're kind of fearless and bold. I think of like a matador. I've been to Spain. I've seen the running of the bulls, and I would definitely describe the matadors as being intrepid. 7 is mediocre, and something that is mediocre is ordinary. It's what you would expect. It's kind of average. And so mediocre, again, is one of those words that can kind of have negative connotations because nobody wants to be considered mediocre or average or ordinary. But it can also mean just kind of what's the norm. So if you look at this landscape, if you are surrounded by beautiful country with tons of mature trees and gorgeous blue skies, then maybe this horizon is just kind of mediocre. Like you see it every day. It's ordinary. 8 is ordeal. An ordeal it's a noun, and it's anything that really strains your person, right? It really tests your courage, your strength, your patience, maybe your conscience. And so, just surviving high school for a lot of teenagers is an ordeal, right? Because you have friendships that maybe aren't, super positive in your life, or friends turn on you. And now young people are also juggling social media. And so you say the wrong thing on Twitter, or you post the wrong thing on Instagram, and you might get a backlash against you. And so all of those everyday stresses can feel really big. They can feel like an ordeal, testing your courage and your strength as a person. And oftentimes I think of like young, like babies, and just them every single day. Everything's this ordeal, right? Because they're just learning how to crawl or walk, and everything really does test their understanding, their strength, their courage as little developing humans. 9 is rampant, and anything described as rampant grows kind of without check or restraint, which means it grows, climbs, runs, moves, unchecked. So it really, I think of like weeds. Weeds can be rampant in a yard where they're just everywhere. They're popping up left and right, and you have to spend every weekend kind of pulling weeds to keep track of, or to keep kind of maintenance of your garden. In the rainy season, sometimes in the classroom, like ants feel like they just run rampant, like they're everywhere because they're looking to get indoors and away from the rain. I always think of ivy when I think of rampant, because when ivy starts growing somewhere, man, it just takes over. 10 is rote, and it's a noun. It's the repetition of words or sounds to try to learn those words or sounds. And so a lot of times in like the history of United States education system, lots of things were learned by rote. And some people still learn this way, right? You make note cards, and so you'll have like a stack of index cards before you go into a final exam, and you're just flipping through all your vocabulary words, or you're flipping through all of the names of, people you have to be tested on for history, or events, historical events, or biology terms, or whatever it is you're studying. If you're just kind of flipping note cards, then you're studying by rote. If you're online and you're using like Quizlet or Study Blue to review your vocabulary, you're doing that by rote. And kind of the old joke is, kids would write sentences over and over again, sometimes for punishment, but sometimes they'd write words over and over again to learn them by rote. 11 is stigma, and it's a mark, but not like a physical mark. It's it's like a stain on your reputation. So the definition, this SAT definition says it's a mark of infamy or token of disgrace attaching to a person as a result of evil doing, which sounds so severe. But basically when you think of stigma, it's a mark of disgrace. So if you think about literature, Hester Prynne wore the letter A, right? And that was her scarlet letter. That was a physical stigma, right? That was attached to her body, so nobody could forget what she had done, which was commit adultery. If you think really recently, if you follow the news at all, you might have heard Brian Williams, who's that very famous NBC anchor. He was actually kind of temporarily dismissed from his position for misleading the American people about what happened in the Iraq War. He kind of made up a story that wasn't exactly accurate, and so he has this stigma attached to him that maybe he's not super honest. And when we think about criminals who go into the prison system, they definitely come out with a stigma. Yes, they serve their time, but then they try to apply for a job or do anything in our society, and they carry around this stigma about them that they can never truly shake. 12 is terminate. It's a verb, and to terminate is to put an end or stop to something. If you've watched the Terminator movies, just kind of keep that in mind, right? So the Terminator goes in to terminate, to put an end, to put a stop to the bad things that are happening. And so, if a road is closed, they're putting a stop to, they're terminating all traffic in that area. They're putting a stop to it. 13 is verbiage, and verbiage is a noun. And it's basically when you use too many words, right? You say something and you use a lot of words when only a few words are actually needed. As an English teacher, I'm definitely guilty of using verbiage when I talk because we tend to talk a lot and maybe use more words than we need to. Maybe you would even describe it as using a superfluous amount of words when someone kind of is just talking and doesn't need to be talking as much as they are. If you watch any political debates, you'll see verbiage in action, right? The political candidates just kind of going off and talking when really they could be much more powerful if they made a clear, concise statement. 14 is contrite. And someone who is described as contrite is showing sincere remorse. They feel really bad about something they've done, and usually you're contrite because you're filled with guilt or you really regret how you've acted. And so sometimes when my kids misbehave and we get into kind of an angry back and forth, afterwards, we both feel. I feel contrite because sometimes I'm like, I'm so frustrated with you. And they feel contrite because they knew they shouldn't have acted the way that they did. So kind of we both feel sad and a little guilty and regret having lost our temper with each other. And I'm sure in the teenage years, this is only exacerbated and made worse because so much is happening in your lives. And so you might talk back or say something you don't mean. And then you just, you feel contrite. You feel badly about what you've said or done. 15 is svelte, and someone who's described as svelte is slender and graceful in figure or outline. And typically someone who's described as svelte, I automatically think of like an hourglass figure, someone with just like a really nice figure. And for me, when I think of this word, I automatically think of Marilyn Monroe, which is interesting because our models today or our actresses today tend to be so much thinner than Marilyn Monroe, who I think had a dress size of a 12 when she was at her kind of height of popularity. But she's very svelte, and was slender for that time period and very graceful in her movements. And so she's the person that I would think of when I think of svelte, because sometimes, to be honest, some of our models are so thin now, I wouldn't even use this word to describe them.